Hello, this is the Unit 5 Differential Impacts, Vulnerability, and Preparedness by Population, Location, and Demographic Factors, Week 11, Women, Children, and Elderly, mini lecture for Sci 333, Psychology of Climate Change and Disasters at University of Maine at Augusta. We're continuing this week on some of the differential impacts of climate change that will be experienced across populations. Last week we looked at some of the physical, land, and economic and political differences experienced by indigenous and minority populations around the globe. This week we'll be looking at women, children, and the elderly. In the United States, it can seem strange to consider the higher levels of exposure and vulnerability faced by women, children, and elderly because the stratifications it isn't currently so dire here. It's true that women, children, and elderly populations are disproportionately represented in impoverished communities here, and so they do have overall higher rates of vulnerability to disasters and climate change. But it's also true that we are unlikely to see the levels of disparity and oppression that exist in some other parts of the world. And it is this level of disparity that makes women, children, and elderly populations globally very high risk for climate change. So, first of all, why are we considering these three populations together? Well, child care and elderly care both still fall disproportionately on women. One of the many benefits and successes of the women's liberation movement here in the United States is that there's increasing equality for women in the workplace and increasing equality for men and women as caregivers in the home. So we are more likely to see men as primary or sole caregivers of children and elderly parents now than, say, like 50 years ago. And stay-at-home dads, for example, are much more accepted and expected, but they're not quite the norm yet. Even in the United States, we still see women are spending more hours and even years of their lives caring for family members. But in many places around the world, almost the entirety of this responsibility falls on women in the society. And this includes single women who are therefore the sole wage earner of the family, but it also includes single women who don't really have access to employment and don't have the capacity to be wage earners. And in fact, it's this disparity in education and work opportunities that is one of the primary reasons we see such high rates of poverty among women and the people that they care for, children and the elderly. And so one of the reasons why we're considering these three populations together this week is that we do see these disproportionate rates of poverty, and we often also see them together in societies. Now, the report by the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, the report titled Gender and Disasters, speaks to the fundamental fact that increasing gender equality in a society also increases disaster resilience of one half or more of the population. And furthermore, disaster preparedness and resilience activities should consider gender as a factor for planning, particularly in locations where there are vastly different lived experiences between men and women. If women have very little freedom in a society and the disaster plans are written with the assumption that everyone who follows this plan will have a certain level of freedom, then really only part of the population is going to be able to follow that plan. This is a short report, it's highly readable, and it has a lot of really great information packed into it, including case studies and examples from around the world. The article by Boothby, Trauma and Violence Among Refugee Children, may be particularly poignant to you reading it now. We are in the midst of a refugee crisis in Europe where we have millions of refugees fleeing from their home countries. Boothby discusses the cognitive and developmental issues that affect children who are affected by high level of stress associated with being in war-torn environments and from having to leave their homes due to violence and conflict. It's important to note as you read this article that many conflicts last years, even generations. Children who are born into these conflicts may live them throughout their lives. And so the social, psychological, and political issues that are faced by children who are in these conflicts may continue to be faced by them throughout their entire lifespan. So this could be like a lifelong context. Children can be, have been, and are used in conflicts, killing them as acts of terror, abducting them, forcing them to become child soldiers. And of course, those who are victims of violence, who lose loved ones, who lose their entire families, who are left alone either within their country or as refugees. Boothby looks at the clinical impacts on children who are victims of violence and or forced to become perpetrators of violence. And he also discusses therapy options, particularly within the context of war, because that will create different therapy options. Yeah. We're discussing some of the psychological impacts before, such as PTSD following a disaster. So why are we looking at PTSD after war? Well, let's come back to our current refugee crisis in Europe. Follow it back a few years in the current conflict in Syria, for example, that has caused so many refugees to flee into Europe. It was largely, or in part at least, caused by climate change. Syria fell under an extreme drought in 2006 that ultimately destroyed crops and livestock and left the country in ravages of famine. The high levels of food insecurity with astronomical food prices, starving people, farmers, and others who had had their livelihoods ruined. It created a state of social and political unrest that was exacerbated by other political forces. The brutal actions of the Syrian government and the uprising of her people didn't happen in a vacuum out of nowhere. They were preceded by this environmental catastrophe. Some estimates predict that we could see 200 million climate refugees by the middle of this century. This term, climate refugees, is a bit controversial because, as we've discussed, it's hard to say that any one storm or event was caused by climate change. But in part, it's also controversial because the reality of the situation is that when land becomes unstable, unstable populations and governments become volatile. And so we do see rises in political instability and violent conflict during heat waves, during El Nino years, in response to resource limiting and livelihood destroying events like drought. These things do not happen on their own. It's not just climate change that is creating these refugees. It's part of a much more complex social system that we have been talking about in pieces throughout the semester. So this week, keep an eye on your email and the course announcements for updates on the survey and the workshops. We do have IRB approval, and so we're going to be able to move forward with these things in the next couple of weeks. We will have the workshop schedule soon, and if you are creating a web resource or if you are participating in one of the alternative projects to explore current events in disaster and climate change, please let me know if you have any additional questions on how to create these projects or what exactly to do with them. I'm available to talk through options and brainstorm, and I will talk to you soon.